Bob Marley never forgot the sound the ocean made the night the man found him. The waves outside the small house in Miami moved like slow breathing, steady and calm, while inside everything changed in a single sentence. The man did not knock. He simply appeared, standing near the doorway as if he had always been there, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of money, danger, and a promise that felt like a threat. "Mr. Marley," he said softly, "my boss would like to meet you. Tonight." Bob did not ask who the boss was. He already knew. In certain circles, names were not spoken. They were felt. The man who sent this messenger owned nightclubs, ports, politicians, and people. A man rumored to decide who disappeared and who became rich overnight. A man people said never asked twice. Bob felt his chest tighten, but he kept his face steady. Fear had learned long ago that it could not show itself on his skin. The messenger continued as if offering a casual invitation to dinner. "There will be a private audience. No press, no cameras, no contracts, just a performance. You will be well compensated." Then he placed a black envelope on the table. It was thick, heavy, the kind of heavy that could change lives forever. Bob did not touch it. He only stared at it like it was a loaded weapon. "But before we continue, I want to make a very special invitation. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps me see that you support me and are enjoying my stories. And comment below which city you're watching us from. Now let's continue." Bob finally looked up. "Money has never decided what I sing," he said calmly. The messenger smiled for the first time, but there was no warmth in it. "My boss believes everything has a price," he replied. "If not money, then fear." And with that he turned and left as quietly as he had arrived. Bob stayed frozen long after the door closed. The envelope remained on the table, silent and patient. He thought of his children sleeping in the back rooms. He thought of his wife, who had learned to read his silence better than his words. And he thought of the long road that brought him here, from nothing to a voice that now echoed around the world. He had promised himself long ago that no empire of violence would ever own his music, but promises were easy when no one tested them with a blank check. He finally opened the envelope. Inside was a simple white card with one line printed in black ink. "You name the number." Nothing else. No threats. No instructions. Just confidence. Bob felt a strange chill crawl through his arms, not from fear alone, but from the certainty behind that sentence. That night he could not sleep. The ceiling fan spun slowly above him as he listened to the quiet breathing of his family. Every success he had was suddenly tied to a new risk. Refusing could mean retaliation. Accepting could mean stepping into a world where music was no longer freedom, but leverage. At dawn, when the sky was still grey, Bob made his decision. He would go, not for the money, but to look the devil in the eyes and understand what he wanted. The meeting took place in a closed nightclub overlooking the harbour. The building was empty except for a single man sitting at a table near the stage. Tall, immaculate suit, silver hair pulled neatly back. The kind of man who seemed carved out of patience and control. No guard stood beside him. Bob immediately knew that meant he did not need them. "You came," the boss said with a soft nod. "That already tells me you are not owned by fear." Bob did not sit. "You didn't invite me for compliments," he said. The man smiled faintly. "No, I invited you because my son is dying, and he wants to hear you sing before he goes." The words hit Bob harder than any threat could have. The cold logic he expected was replaced by something fragile and desperate. "You could have asked honestly," Bob said. "Without the games." The boss's eyes darkened. "In my world, honesty gets you buried. Power gets you answers." He slid the blank check across the table. "Sing for him 1 night, 1 hour, then you walk away with any number you choose." Bob looked at the check. His hands trembled for the first time since the messenger had arrived. "And if I refuse?" The boss did not answer right away. Outside, the water slapped against the dock. "Then I will still be dying rich," he finally said. "And you will learn how poor a man becomes when he loses what he loves." Bob felt the invisible line being drawn. This was no longer about money. It was about whose will would bend first. "I don't sell my soul," Bob said quietly. The boss studied him for a long moment. Then he stood. "Good," he replied, "because that is not what I am buying." Bob left the club knowing he had just walked into something far larger than a single performance. What he did not know yet was that his refusal had already begun to set other events in motion. Events involving betrayal, secrets, and a truth that would force both of them to confront who they really were when the music stopped. And as Bob stepped into the rising sunlight, he felt something rare and dangerous stirring in his chest. Not fear, not courage, but the heavy certainty that once a man like that asks you to sing, silence is no longer an option. Bob did not tell his wife what had happened that morning. He kissed her goodbye as he always did, gently on the forehead, then stepped outside as if the world had not shifted under his feet. The Florida heat wrapped around him early, thick and heavy, and the sky was already a hard blue. As he walked toward his car, every instinct inside him warned that the meeting at the club was only the beginning. Powerful men never made simple requests. They planted seeds and waited to see what grew. By noon, the confirmation came. A man from the boss's organization appeared at the studio where Bob was rehearsing. This one wore no suit, just a clean white shirt and jeans, the uniform of someone who wanted to appear harmless. "Mr. Marley," he said, lowering his voice, "my boss would like you to meet his son this afternoon." Bob stopped strumming his guitar mid-chord. The sound died like a cut heartbeat. "I haven't agreed to anything," Bob replied. The man nodded politely. "It's not a performance. It's a father's request." Against his better judgment, Bob followed. They went north, away from the city, past gated neighborhoods and quiet streets where everything looked peaceful on the surface. The house stood alone near the water, large but not flashy. No guards in sight, no weapons visible. That unnerved Bob more than a fortress would have. Inside, the air smelled of medicine and ocean salt. The son lay in a wide bed near the open balcony doors, thin under white sheets, his skin pale with illness. He looked no older than 25. The young man turned his head slowly when Bob entered. His eyes widened with something like disbelief. "It's really you," he whispered. Bob stepped closer, unsure of what to say. The boy's voice was weak, but his smile was steady. "My dad said you might not come," he admitted. "He said you're the only man he can't control." Bob sat beside the bed. "Your father wanted to pay me," he said softly. The boy chuckled, then coughed painfully. "That sounds like him," he answered. "He buys everything because he doesn't know how to ask." For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The sound of waves filled the room. Finally, the young man looked at Bob with sudden seriousness. "He built his empire by breaking people," he said. "But he built me by trying to protect me from that world. That's the joke of our life." His fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of the blanket. "He thinks your music can save me from dying scared." Bob felt his throat tighten. This was not what he had expected. Not at all. "I'm just a singer," he said. "I can't fight sickness." The boy shook his head slowly. "You fight something worse," he whispered. "Despair." Later that evening, Bob was taken back to the nightclub. This time, the boss waited near the stage alone in the half-dark. "You met him?" the man said before Bob could speak. "Yes," Bob replied. "And now I understand why you want the concert." The boss's eyes softened just slightly. "So you think this makes me weak?" he said. "It makes me desperate." Bob hesitated before speaking again. "You could have asked without threats," he said. The boss let out a slow breath. "In my world, kindness is used against you," he replied. Then, after a long pause, he added, "But you are not from my world." A silence stretched between them. Finally, Bob asked the question he had avoided since morning. "What happens if I sing?" The boss turned toward the stage, looking at the empty microphone. "My son dies hearing the one voice that ever made him forget pain," he said, "and you walk away untouched." Bob frowned. "And if I refuse?" The boss slowly faced him again. "Then he still dies," he answered. "But you will carry the knowledge that you chose yourself over him." That night, Bob drove alone for hours. He thought of the young man's eyes. He thought of the boss standing alone under the stage lights, stripped of his army, stripped of his money, reduced to nothing but a father begging without admitting it. Bob had spent his life singing about freedom, about breaking chains, about love without conditions. Now those words were testing him in the harshest way possible. The next day, Bob began to sense something else shifting around him. Strange cars parked near his home for a few seconds too long. Unknown numbers called his phone and hung up. Musicians he trusted were suddenly advised to cancel upcoming sessions. Pressure began wrapping around him like invisible wire. The boss had promised no contracts, no threats, but the world had its own language of persuasion. That evening, Bob received an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a photograph. It showed his wife walking their youngest child to school that morning. No message, no signature, just the image. Bob felt something cold spread through his chest. The boss had not threatened him, but someone in his empire had decided to push. That was when Bob realized the truth. The real danger wasn't the dying son. It wasn't even the powerful father. It was the machine around them both, the system that survived on fear and obedience. And that machine had already marked him. Still, Bob did not call the boss. He did not agree. He did not beg. Instead, he went into his studio alone that night and played until his fingers bled. He poured the confusion, the anger, and the fear into his strings. For the first time since his fame had begun, his music felt like a shield and a weapon at the same time. Across the city, in his silent room, the dying son listened to recordings of Bob's songs through trembling headphones. And the boss, sitting in the dark of his office, watched the clock and realized for the first time in his life that power could not make time obey him. The decision Bob would make next would not only shape one family's fate, it would expose truths buried so deep that even the Queen of Fear herself could not silence them once they came to the surface. Bob did not sleep that night. The photograph lay on his kitchen table like an accusation that refused to fade. Every few minutes his eyes drifted back to it, as if the image might change. It didn't. His wife's familiar posture, his child's small backpack, the ordinary sidewalk they walked every day, all of it suddenly felt staged, exposed, fragile. The message was clear without a single word attached. They could watch. And if they could watch, they could touch. When morning came, Bob sent his family away without explaining why. He told his wife he had a sudden opportunity out of town, and that it would be safer if she and the kids spent a few days with her sister. She looked at him with suspicion, sensing the lie beneath his calm tone, but she agreed. She had learned long ago that when fear hid in his silence, pushing him only made it grow. As soon as he watched their car disappear around the corner, Bob felt the weight of loneliness crash down on him. For the first time, refusing the Mafia boss no longer felt like a moral stand. It felt like a gamble with other people's lives. That afternoon, the boss called him directly. "You sent my family a warning," Bob said the second he answered. The man's voice came through smooth and composed. "No," he replied, "I didn't." Bob clenched his jaw. "Someone in your world did." There was a pause that lasted just long enough to feel dangerous. Then, "Someone in my world overstepped," the boss said. "And that is not something I allow." Bob did not know whether to believe him. "Your world already crossed into mine," Bob said. "You promised no threats." The boss's voice lowered. "And I kept my promise," he answered. "This was not my hand. But understand me clearly now, Mr. Marley. Whether you sing or not, the machine around me does not move by feelings. It moves by momentum." "Then stop it," Bob snapped. "You're the only one who can." Silence stretched across the line. When the boss finally spoke, the steel was back in his tone. "You think a king controls every soldier," he said. "That is a comforting illusion." They ended the call without resolution. By evening, Bob understood something terrifying. The longer he delayed his answer, the more dangerous the space between his refusal and the boss's desperation became. Power did not tolerate uncertainty. Weakness invited chaos. And chaos did not ask for permission before it swallowed innocent people whole. He returned to the studio, not to rehearse, but to confront the truth he had been avoiding. His entire career had been built on defiance without a face. He sang against injustice, against corruption, against systems of control. But now injustice had a face, corruption had a name, and the system stood close enough to breathe on his family. Late that night, the boss appeared at the studio unannounced. No entourage, no disguise, just the man and his shadow. "You are putting my son in the crossfire of your hesitation," the boss said quietly. Bob stood across from him, guitar still strapped over his shoulder. "Your empire put my family there first," Bob replied. The boss studied him with eyes older than his body. "Then we are both losing control," he said, "and that makes what comes next worse for everyone." Bob finally asked the question that had been burning inside him since the beginning. "Why me?" The boss turned his gaze to the soundboard, to the cables, to the empty microphones. "Because he doesn't fear me," he said. "He fears dying without feeling human one last time, and your voice does that to him." For the first time, Bob saw something crack behind the man's power. "I buried enemies without losing sleep," the boss continued. But my son looks at me like I failed him. That is a wound I don't know how to survive." Bob swallowed hard. "If I agree, my family disappears from your radar," he said. "Completely." The boss nodded slowly. "They become ghosts," he replied. "Untouchable." "And afterward?" Bob pressed. "After the concert?" The boss's jaw tightened. "After that," he said, "there is no bond between us." Bob turned away, overwhelmed. This was no longer a contract. It was a transaction between two failures pretending to be strong men. One had money and power, but no cure. The other had a voice and love, but no armor. Before Bob could speak again, a loud crash echoed from outside. Tires screeched. Shouts erupted in the street. Both men moved at the same time toward the window. A group of masked men had swarmed the boss's car. Guns were visible, but no shots were fired. The chaos was swift and brutal. The boss's driver was pulled out and beaten to the ground. Bob's heart slammed against his ribs. "Those aren't mine," the boss said through clenched teeth. In seconds, his men arrived, scattering the attackers. The street fell into stunned silence. The message was unmistakable. Someone else wanted control of the situation. Someone who had decided to accelerate the violence regardless of the boss's restraint. The boss turned back to Bob, his face transformed. "Now you see," he said quietly. "This is what your silence creates." That night, Bob made the hardest decision of his life. He would sing, not for the money, not for the boss, not even for the dying son alone. He would sing because somewhere between threat and fear, other innocent lives had been pulled into a war they never chose. And if his voice could redirect the storm even for one night, he would step into it willingly. But what Bob did not yet know was that agreeing to the performance did not mean stepping out of danger. It meant walking straight into the center of it. The morning Bob agreed to sing, the world outside felt strangely quiet, as if the air itself were holding its breath. He drove toward the harbor, where the private concert would take place the following night. The water shimmered under the rising sun, calm and deceptive, hiding currents beneath. As he approached the nightclub, he expected guards at the door or men whispering into radios. Instead, the entrance stood unprotected, wide open, as if inviting him into a secret he wasn't meant to understand. Inside, the boss waited near the stage, hands clasped behind his back, his posture controlled but his eyes clouded with exhaustion. "I've arranged everything," he said. "No press, no outsiders, only my son, my doctor, and a few men I trust." Bob studied him. The boss no longer radiated the untouchable confidence he wore like a second skin. He looked more like a man fighting grief with his bare hands. "You said there would be no contracts," Bob reminded him. The boss nodded. "There aren't," he said. "Not legally." He motioned toward the bar where a single folder lay on the counter. "But I want you to know what's at stake," the boss continued. "Not for me, for you." Bob approached slowly. The folder looked ordinary, but his stomach tightened as soon as he lifted the cover. Inside were photographs, notes, and documents, none belonging to him, none belonging to his family, but all tied to him in a single frightening way: the rival faction. Bob flipped through the pages. Surveillance images of cars parked near his home, notes suggesting times when his children walked to school, lists of people close to him, including band members, neighbors, even his wife's workplace. But the most chilling page was a handwritten note at the bottom: "If we can't break the father, we break the singer. The concert must not happen." Bob felt the room tilt slightly. He placed both hands on the counter to steady himself. "They're planning something," he whispered. "Something to stop all this." The boss nodded, jaw tight. "They want to embarrass me," he said. "They want to make me powerless in front of my son. And they think the easiest way is through you." Bob kept reading. "What exactly do they intend to do?" he asked, lifting his eyes. The boss hesitated. "They plan to sabotage the performance," he said finally. "A blackout, a fake emergency, maybe even an abduction attempt, staged to humiliate me." Bob closed the folder, his pulse thundering in his ears. "And you waited until now to tell me?" The boss met his gaze squarely. "Would it have changed your decision?" Bob wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that this information would have been enough to walk away, to protect his family from the shadows circling the event. But the truth clung to him like a weight. He still would have come, because walking away now meant letting the rival faction dictate fear. "Why didn't you call the police?" Bob asked. The boss let out a humorless exhale. "Because the police don't calm storms," he said. They just write down the wreckage afterward. They moved to the stage, where equipment had been set early by a select group of technicians. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the air seemed fragile. Bob stepped up to the microphone, testing its height, imagining the dying sun in the front row. 1 hour, Bob murmured. That's all you're asking. The boss nodded. 1 hour where he won't feel alone. Bob stared at the empty seats. He thought of the boy's fragile smile, the quiet bravery in his voice, the way he clung to music as if it were the only thread connecting him to life. I'll do it, Bob said again. But something in his tone carried a new certainty now. Not resignation, but vigilance. The boss stepped closer. There's something else, he said. Something I didn't tell you before. Bob turned slowly. Then tell me now. The man inhaled deeply. My son doesn't know about the threat, he said. He believes tomorrow is only about hope, not war. Bob's chest tightened. And you want me to keep lying to him? The boss's voice softened. I want him to have one night untainted by fear. He's had enough of that. Bob understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. A few hours later, Bob returned home, only to find a new envelope waiting on his doorstep. No name, no mark. Inside was a single note and a piece of torn black fabric. The note read, "You think you made a choice. You didn't. You just stepped onto our stage." Bob closed his eyes, breathing through the rising panic. The rival faction was growing bolder. The torn fabric was unmistakably part of a ski mask, the kind he'd seen during the attack on the boss's driver. He tossed the envelope into the glove compartment and drove to meet one of the only people he trusted outside his family, an old sound engineer named Ray, a man who had been with him since before his fame. Ray listened carefully, leaning on a stack of amplifiers. "You shouldn't do this alone," Ray finally said. Bob shook his head. "I'm not putting anyone else in the line of fire." Ray placed a hand on Bob's shoulder. "You're already in it," he said. As they rehearsed late into the night, Bob tried to focus on the music, but his mind drifted constantly. The rival group, the boy's face, the boss's fear, the torn mask, the folder full of threats. Every piece formed a puzzle, but the final image remained hidden. When rehearsal ended, Bob walked outside and found the boss waiting for him again, leaning against a dark sedan. "Ray saw me," he said, nodding toward the studio. "He doesn't know who I am, but he knows what kind of men wait in the dark." Bob crossed his arms. "What do you want now?" The boss straightened. "To warn you," he said. "We intercepted communication from the rival faction. They're planning to move during the performance." Bob's blood ran cold. "Move how?" he demanded. The boss locked eyes with him. "Not a blackout. Not a threat." He paused. "They want to take you. Publicly." Bob took a step back. For the first time, real fear flashed across the boss's face. Not for himself, not even for Bob, but for the son who would watch his world collapse in real time. "Then we stop them," Bob said. The boss shook his head. "They're already inside places I can't see. Tomorrow is a trap for all of us." Bob felt something shift deep inside him. Not panic, but purpose. "They think they're ready," he murmured. "But they haven't heard me sing yet." The boss stared at him, confused. Bob stepped closer. "If tomorrow is a trap," he said, "then we turn it inside out." The boss slowly nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could know, was that the performance would shatter much more than a rivalry. It would expose a secret hidden so deeply inside the boss's empire that once revealed, no amount of power could bury it again. The night of the concert arrived, wrapped in a strange stillness. The sky above the harbor was clear, too clear, as if even the clouds had stepped aside to watch what would unfold. Bob arrived early, moving through the backstage corridor with slow, measured steps. Every sound felt louder than it should. The hum of electrical equipment, the soft murmur of men stationed at every exit, the distant water brushing against the dock. The nightclub had been transformed into something between a sanctuary and a battlefield. He could feel danger in the air, but he could also feel expectation. Somewhere beyond the stage curtain, a dying young man waited to hear a voice that had carried him through pain. Somewhere else, hidden among shadows and disguises, men waited to turn this night into chaos. The boss stood near the front row beside his son's wheelchair. The boy looked impossibly thin under the soft stage lights, but his eyes shone with a quiet excitement. When he saw Bob enter, his face lit up with a weak but genuine smile. The boss noticed it too. For just a second, his empire disappeared from his posture. He was only a father watching his child feel hope. Bob approached slowly. The boy whispered, "You came." Bob knelt beside him. "I promised," he replied softly. The boy swallowed with effort. "I don't need a long concert," he said. "Just one song where I forget everything else." Bob placed a hand gently over his. "Then I'll give you more than one," he murmured. Minutes later, the lights dimmed. The room fell into absolute silence. When Bob stepped onto the stage, the sound of footsteps alone seemed to echo forever. He adjusted the microphone, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and then began. The first note cut through the darkness like a blade made of light. The room changed instantly. Men who had lived their lives with weapons at their reach stood frozen. Doctors stopped watching monitors and listened. The boss lowered his head slowly, his shoulders stiff, his face locked in a struggle between control and collapse. And the boy, his chest rose and fell in a shallow rhythm, but his eyes shone brighter with every word. Bob sang about freedom, about chains that fall without warning, about redemption that waits even for those who believe they deserve none. His voice filled every corner of the room, wrapping itself around fear, around grief, around guilt that had been silent for decades. Before we continue, tell me in the comments what you think of this story so far and what you would do in his place. Don't leave the video because what comes next will give you chills. Midway through the third song, Bob noticed movement near the back entrance, a flicker of bodies shifting where there should have been stillness. His voice never faltered, but his senses sharpened. He recognized the rhythm of bad intent the way a storm recognizes wind. Two men slipped toward the side corridor. Another moved along the upper balcony. The rival faction had arrived. Bob shifted the tempo of the song without missing a beat, stretching a note longer than planned, giving time to men who had been quietly placed where danger was expected. The boss noticed the shift immediately. His hand moved subtly. Orders traveled without words. The boy, lost in the music, felt none of it. Then the power cut. The lights vanished in a collective gasp. Darkness swallowed the room. A woman cried out. Chairs scraped. Panic tried to rise, but Bob kept singing. No microphone, no amplification, just his raw voice slicing through the night. His sound became an anchor. Emergency lights flickered on seconds later. In that brief window of confusion, armed men surged from the shadows, rushing the stage from the side. Bob saw them. The boss saw them. And for the first time in his life, the boss did not move toward violence. He moved toward his son. Gunshots did not erupt. Instead, hands wrestled, bodies slammed into chairs. A struggle of breath and muscle unfolded in near silence beneath the echo of Bob's voice. One attacker lunged for the stage, another aimed toward the front row. Bob stepped forward. A guard intercepted the man at the last second. They crashed to the floor beneath the boy's chair. The boss shielded his son with his own body, kneeling over him, his perfect suit tearing against the ground. Bob kept singing. Then everything stopped. Men lay restrained on the floor. The rival attackers were disarmed, stunned by how quickly their ambush had collapsed. The lights returned fully. The room stood frozen in disbelief. Bob finished the last line of the song with his voice shaking. The boy was crying. Not from fear, from release. "I heard every word," he whispered, voice breaking. "I didn't feel pain for a whole moment." The boss lifted his head slowly. His eyes were wet. He looked at Bob, not like a king, like a man who had just watched his world nearly end in front of him. Medical staff rushed forward. The attacking men were dragged away. The danger had passed, but something far bigger had been set in motion. After the last guest was evacuated, Bob remained alone on the stage while the boss approached him in silence. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "You saved him twice tonight," he said, "with your voice and with your courage." Bob stepped down. "The war isn't over," he said. "They didn't come for humiliation alone." The boss nodded slowly. "No, they came for something else." He looked toward the darkened entrance. "And now I know what they wanted." Bob frowned. "What?" The boss's face hardened. "Not you," he said. "Not me." He paused. "They wanted what happens next." At that moment, the doctor's voice broke through the tense quiet. "He's stabilizing," the doctor said. "For now." The boy reached for his father's hand weakly. The boss took it with shaking fingers. Bob watched the moment in silence, his chest heavy with everything that had not ended yet. And deep within the shadows beyond that room, the rival faction prepared their final move. Not against a singer, but against a secret buried inside the boss's empire that no one was supposed to uncover. A secret that would pull the entire structure apart from the inside. The silence after the failed attack did not feel like peace. It felt like the moment after an earthquake, when the ground still trembles under your feet, and you don't yet know which buildings will fall next. Bob remained backstage long after the doctors moved the boy back to his private room. The sound of restraint cables being removed, the quiet urgency of men reporting into radios, and the distant sirens near the harbor blended into a low, constant hum. The boss stood alone near the edge of the stage, staring at the spot where Bob had sung. For the first time since they'd met, he looked old. "They didn't come for a hostage," the boss said quietly as Bob approached him. "They came to complete something." Bob folded his arms. "Then tell me what they were really after," he said. The boss didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and began walking toward his private office at the back of the club. Bob followed without being invited. The corridor behind the stage felt narrower than it had earlier, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Inside the office, the boss closed the door and activated a sound jammer with a small switch on his desk. The room fell unnaturally quiet. He went to a hidden drawer and removed a thick envelope sealed with dark wax. "My son doesn't know who his mother really was," he said suddenly. Bob's brow tightened. "What does that have to do with tonight?" The boss placed the envelope on the desk between them. "Everything." He broke the seal and slid the contents across the polished wood. Inside were photographs, photocopied records, and a worn hospital bracelet with a name printed on it. Bob picked it up slowly and read it. The name belonged to the sister of the head of the rival faction. Bob's breath caught. "Your enemy's sister," he whispered. The boss nodded. "My son is her child," he said. "She never told him who his father was, and I never told him who his mother was." Bob felt the room spin slightly. "Then the rival faction didn't come to destroy you tonight," he said. "They came to retrieve blood." The boss's jaw tightened. "They discovered the truth last month," he said. "They realized that my greatest weakness had been hiding in plain sight all these years. They didn't want to kill him." His voice lowered. "They wanted to take him." A horrifying realization swept through Bob. The attack, the blackout, the chaos, it was all meant to separate him from you. The boss nodded once. "And your presence disrupted the timing. You were never the prize." He met Bob's eyes. "You were the distraction." Bob took a step back, anger flaring in his chest. "You used me," he said sharply. "You knew this might happen." The boss did not deny it. "And still you came," he replied, "because you are not like us." Before Bob could respond, the office door burst open. A guard staggered inside, pale. "They took him," he said breathlessly. "During the transfer back to the private residence. Ambulance wasn't ours." The words struck like physical blows. The boss froze. For a split second, all the power in his posture collapsed into something raw and human. Then he moved. Bob followed as they tore through the back corridors, out into the parking area where flashing emergency lights painted everything in broken colors. An empty stretcher lay abandoned near the gates. One of the medical staff was on the ground, shaken, but alive. "They waited until the crowd dispersed," the boss growled. "Perfect timing." Bob's chest burned. The concert, the song, the guards. None of it had been enough. "They used your silence against you," Bob said. "They waited until you thought it was over." The boss rounded on him. "And now my son will grow up inside my enemy's house," he said, "or he won't grow up at all." Bob stepped closer, unflinching. "Then we stop this now," he said. "Not with your rules, not with theirs." The boss stared at him, incredulous. "What do you think you can do?" Bob's voice did not rise. It did not shake. "I already stepped into their plan once," he said. "They think they control the narrative. Let me take it from them." Within the hour, Bob was moved to a secure location outside the city. The boss mobilized every contact he had. Cars flooded the highways. Ships prepared to leave the docks. But it was Bob who made the move no one expected. He went live, on every major platform. One camera, one microphone, no music, no filters, just his face. "My name is Bob Marley," he said calmly into the lens. "Tonight, a dying young man was taken from a hospital under protection. He is innocent. He is not a prize. He is not a message. He is a life." He paused, his eyes steady and unafraid. "Whoever took him knows exactly who they are, and now the world knows too." The broadcast exploded across the internet. Within minutes, millions were watching. Identifying details began surfacing faster than anyone could contain. The rival faction had always moved through shadows. Bob had dragged them into light. "You'll get him killed," one of the boss's men warned. The boss said nothing. He was watching the screen like a man watching fire climb a wall. Bob leaned toward the camera one last time. "If you keep him," he said softly, "you don't just fight me anymore. You fight the eyes of the world." Then he shut the feed off. The phone rang less than 2 minutes later. Bob answered it without hesitation. "We'll trade," a voice said coldly on the other end. "Singer for blood." Bob closed his eyes slowly, and in that moment, he understood the truth of what he had done. He hadn't stolen back control. He had made himself the final bargaining chip. Bob listened to the silence after the call ended. No threats followed. No conditions beyond the words already spoken. Singer for blood. His hand remained on the phone for a long moment after the line went dead, as if the device might still hold the echo of what had just been decided. The boss stood across the room, motionless. For the first time since Bob had met him, the man looked like someone drowning without water. "They won't keep their word," he said quietly. Bob met his eyes. "Neither do you," he replied. There was no accusation in his voice, only truth. Minutes later, the terms arrived. A location outside the city. Abandoned warehouses near the old rail yard. No police, no media, no armed escort visible. Bob was to arrive alone. The boy would be returned once the trade was confirmed. The boss's men protested immediately, some with anger, some with fear. None of it mattered. Bob raised a calm hand. "This ends tonight," he said, "one way or another." The drive out of the city felt unreal. The skyline faded behind him like a memory dissolving. Every mile stripped another layer of safety away. Bob didn't think about dying. He thought about the boy's face on the stage, about the way pain had loosened its grip for a few minutes. He thought about his wife's smile when she believed he was only chasing another performance. He thought about the lie he had told when he said he didn't need armor. At the rail yard, the shadows were long and broken. Rusted freight cars sat like giant skeletons under dim floodlights. Bob stepped out of the car alone, the echo of his footsteps swallowing the silence. Across the steel yard, a group of figures emerged. At their center stood a man with ice in his posture and hunger in his eyes. Behind him on a stretcher, partially hidden by shadow, lay the boy. Bob's chest burned, but he kept walking. "You're brave," the rival leader said, "or very foolish." Bob stopped 10 feet away. "You wanted me," he replied. "I'm here." The man smiled. "You were never the target," he said lightly. "You were the leverage." Bob glanced toward the stretcher. The boy's eyes flickered open weakly. Their gaze met. The boy's lips moved. No sound came out. Bob nodded once, silently. "Release him," Bob said. The rival leader shook his head. "First, the boss steps into the light," he said. Bob's heart pounded. "He isn't here," he answered. The man chuckled. "Then you die, and the boy stays." A sudden engine growled behind the freight cars. The boss's black sedan rolled into view. His men had warned him. Bob had warned him. Still, he came. The rival leader's smile disappeared. "You disobeyed the rules," he said. The boss stepped out of the car slowly, hands visible, face carved from stone. "Your rule book ends tonight," he said. Guns appeared in hands. Tension thickened until the air itself seemed to fracture. Then the boy convulsed on the stretcher. A medical monitor beeped wildly. Everything changed in a heartbeat. The rival men froze. The boss froze. Bob ran. He didn't think, didn't plan. He reached the stretcher as the boy gasped weakly. "Stay with me," Bob whispered, gripping his hand. "So you fought this far," the rival leader shouted. Someone raised a weapon, and then the boss stepped forward into full view. "Shoot him," the boss said calmly, "and you lose everything you came for." The rival leader sneered. "You think your son still matters to me?" The boss's voice dropped low and lethal. "I think you already lost what mattered without knowing it." At that moment, dozens of red lights ignited around the rail yard. Cameras, drones, hidden broadcasts. Bob's live stream was back. Millions were watching again. The rival leader looked around in shock. His world had been dragged into daylight again. "This trade is over," the boss said. "You return my son. I hand you every financial channel you've been chasing for years. You walk away without blood tonight. or history eats your name alive. The rival leader's jaw trembled with restrained rage. He had lost the shadows. He had lost control of the narrative. The only move left was retreat. Slowly, he gestured to his men. The stretcher was pushed forward. Bob backed away as the boss rushed to his son's side. The boy's breathing steadied under urgent medical aid. His eyes fluttered once toward Bob before closing again. The rival faction retreated into darkness. No victory cry followed, only survival. Hours later, at a private medical facility far from the city, the boss sat beside his son's bed while machines hummed softly. Bob stood near the doorway, watching quietly. "You could have walked away," the boss said without turning, "and tonight would still be my war." Bob shook his head. "Tonight became mine when you put my family in its path," he replied. The boss finally looked at him. "You saved him," he said. "When money couldn't, when power failed." Bob's voice was steady. "Then release me," he said. "Every shadow you ever cast over my life, remove it all." The boss closed his eyes slowly. "It's done," he said. "Your name leaves my world forever." And this time Bob believed him. Outside the hospital, dawn broke softly across the horizon. The war between empires was not over, but the war over one innocent life had ended, and in its quiet aftermath, something much larger stood on the brink of collapse. The dawn light washed over the medical facility like a gentle promise that the night's violence would not repeat itself. Bob stood outside the building for a long time, breathing in the cool air, feeling his heart finally beginning to steady. For the first time in days, nothing chased him. No shadows, no messages, no cars lingering where they shouldn't. Inside, the boy slept under careful medical supervision. The doctors said he had stabilized, though exhaustion clung to every breath he took. His frail body had survived fear, kidnapping, and the brutal shift of adrenaline that came with both rescue and collapse. Yet somehow he was still holding on. Bob walked back inside. The boss sat alone beside his son's bed. Not the feared man who controlled the city from behind invisible strings, not the strategist who built empires, not the king who pretended nothing could wound him. He sat with his shoulders bent and his hands trembling, staring at the boy's face the way fathers do when they realize love has outgrown every lie they've ever told. The boss didn't look up as Bob entered. "He asked for you before he fell asleep," he said. "He called your name." Bob approached slowly. "He needs rest," he whispered, "and peace." The boss let out a slow breath. "Peace is not something I know how to give," he said. "Everything I ever built came from controlling storms, not calming them." Bob glanced at the boy, whose chest rose and fell in a fragile rhythm. "Then maybe it's time to rebuild something else," he said softly. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the boss reached into his coat and placed a black folder on the bedside table. Bob recognized it immediately. His name, his life, his family's movements, all the information that had been weaponized against him. "It's over," the boss said. "No debt, no ties, no invisible lines between us. You walk out of here today untouched, forever." Bob nodded, but he didn't open the folder. Just seeing it relinquished was enough. A nurse entered quietly. "He's asking for both of you," she said. Bob and the boss stepped closer to the bed. The boy's eyelids opened slowly, revealing exhausted but lucid eyes. "Is it morning?" he whispered. The boss swallowed hard. "Yes," he said. "You're safe." The boy looked at Bob. "Did you finish singing last night?" he asked, his voice thin but warm. Bob smiled softly. "I finished the song," he said, "but not the story." The boy's smile was small but real, stronger than any medicine. A doctor stepped in with a clipboard. "There's something you both should know," he said gently. "Last night didn't just strain him, it pushed him past the threshold we feared for weeks. But the strange thing is, his vitals are better today than they've been in months." The boss straightened. "What are you saying?" The doctor hesitated. "I'm saying he's not out of danger, but he's not dying tonight. The recovery path we thought was impossible. It's open again." The room felt lighter, not safe, not healed, but possible. After the doctor left, the boy squeezed his father's hand. "Dad," he whispered, "don't make enemies anymore." The boss's throat worked as he tried to speak. The words didn't come easily. "I'm trying," he finally said. Bob stepped away to let them talk, moving toward the window where sunlight stretched across the floor in gentle lines. The boss joined him minutes later. "You changed him," the boss said quietly. Not with money, not with power, with something I never learned to understand. Bob shook his head. I didn't change him. He changed how you look at him. Silence fell between them, not heavy but reflective. Finally, the boss said, When this settles, I'm leaving the city. Bob turned, startled. What do you mean? The boss looked down at his hands, the hands that once commanded armies. I thought ruling through fear made me strong, he said. But fear is a prison you build for yourself. Last night proved that someone else always has the key. He looked toward the boy's room. I want him to see who I am, not what the world made me. Bob understood. The war, the titles, the empire, none of it meant anything if the boy could not live a life beyond it. Outside, the boss's men were already dispersing. Vehicles left in quiet lines. Phone calls ended with final orders. For the first time in decades, an empire was dissolving without weapons, without blood, without retaliation. Hours later, Bob walked out of the facility into bright afternoon sunlight. He expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt something deeper, clarity. The world was flawed, twisted by power and fear, but people could still choose which legacy they carried forward. As he headed toward the parking lot, he saw a figure leaning against a car. Ray. His old friend grinned. Thought you might need a ride, he said. Bob laughed, a real laugh, full and relieved. I thought I told you not to get involved, he replied. Ray shrugged. I thought I told you I'm stubborn. They drove away from the chaos that had nearly consumed everything. The city skyline reappeared, no longer threatening but familiar again. Bob closed his eyes and let the breeze wash over him. He wasn't the same man who had been approached in a quiet Miami doorway days earlier. He wasn't carrying fear anymore. He wasn't carrying debt. He was carrying truth. And somewhere in a hospital room, a young man fought for his life with renewed strength, because music had reached him in the one place suffering couldn't follow. As the car rolled onto the bridge, Bob finally spoke. I'm going to write a new song, he said. Ray smiled. What's it about? Bob looked out at the sea. About choosing light, he said. Even when the world hands you darkness. They drove on. The story had begun with a blank check, but it ended with something money could never buy. What did you think of the story? Subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who will also be moved today.